So, John Sadler, welcome to the briefing room.
Thank you.
We're here today to talk about, as it reaches for the book, D-Day.
Yep.
And what I loved about this book is it had so many first-hand accounts in it.
Yeah.
And I really found that interesting. I've read a few books on D-Day, but I found that really interesting. What led you to write about D-Day?
Well, it's a campaign that's always fascinated me. You can blame. I'm so old. I remember going to the cinema to see The Longest Day in black and white with every
Yeah,
Hollywood star in the universe.
great movie.
First time round. So, and I've taken many tour groups over the years to Normandy, and it's such a fascinating. It's a beautiful place, but it's also such a fascinating story. And I think to me, it is the pivotal battle of World War II. I mean, there's many others could claim that, but I think really once the Allies were established in France, at the end, the writing was pretty much on the wall for the Third Reich. So I see it as the pivotal battle of the war.
And how did the initial stages shape the British role in the D-Day invasion?
Well, until the D-Day invasion, I'd say really until toward the end of the Normandy campaign, the British were really the senior partners in the Allied war effort. And of course, the Americans, when they'd entered the war after 1941, 1942, 43, they thought, well, they were really wanting to knock Germany out of the war so they could focus on Japan, which was their main enemy.
Mm-hmm.
And but the British, obviously, we'd been at war for a lot longer. We also knew that attacking Festering Europa to get an army ashore in France would be a massive and a very complicated and highly fraught operation. It was far more complex than our American friends actually necessarily at that point actually understood. And really, once Montgomery was appointed as head of Cossack in the 1943, that's really when it began to shape up. So the actual plan for the invasion was Montgomery's. Eisenhower was in charge, absolutely, but really, if you like, the thinking element was Montgomery.
And you concentrate on three beaches. Let me get this right: Juno, Gold, and Sword.
Sword, Juno, Gold, yeah.
Yeah. Why did you choose those three beaches?
Well, they are the British beaches. So the book I wrote is about the British beaches, as opposed to the wider picture, which includes the American beaches, Omaha and Utah, all of which have been very well written up in the past. I really thought that I would wish to focus on the British effort. I'm not in any way denigrating the American effort, which is clearly absolutely crucial. But I just thought that for a British readership, the British element is perhaps, should we say, slightly underplayed compared to the American element. If you watch Saving Private Ryan, it's pretty obvious that the Americans actually won the war without the British being there at all. So
yeah,
I do think perhaps redressing that balance might be a useful exercise.
And actually, talking about Saving Private Ryan, we all see what happens when they get onto those beaches. Just sort of off topic, off the track for a minute. What is it? Why were the guys sent there knowing that was going to happen? Was that just they had faith in their men, or was it? I don't know. Why was it?
Obviously, if the Allies were to effect a full foothold in the Yucatan Peninsula, then, as Montgomery had originally planned, you needed effectively 5 divisions and 5 beaches to get a significant enough foothold and to get you onto the Yucatan Peninsula. So, and to isolate the bridgehead from attacks from the east and the west. So, taking Omaha was a big part of that plan. Everybody knew that Omaha would be the toughest beach because of the nature of the tides, the nature of the sloping sands, and the fact the dunes gave the Germans the most perfect defensive position. And of course, it had years to dig in. So it was always going to be a tough nut. And I think the reality was that the aerial bombardment, naval bombardment were not as effective generally as everybody hoped. So I think everybody knew Omaha was going to be a tough nut, but not necessarily be just as bad as it actually was.
Yeah.
There was the hope that some of the German defensive fire would have been suppressed before the guys hit the beach, but ineffectively it wasn't. The Germans were there, woken up and fully prepared.
Yeah, it was nasty business, wasn't it? What were the key factors that determined the timing of the landings, especially the British landing?
Indeed. Obviously, the timings had to be staggered because it was generally felt that the objective was to kind of get the mid tide. Obviously, if you attacked at low tide, then your guys had a long way further to advance up the beach, potentially under fire, more chance of being caught by the beach obstacles. If you attacked at high tide, well, clearly there wasn't enough beach necessary to occupy, and the obstacles would be hidden. So it was a kind of fine line between what was the optimum point at which to get the guys off the landing craft and onto the beach. And the naval element of D-Day, which is perhaps again not fully played up, was absolutely crucial. It was an astonishing feat of logistics and planning just to get all of those thousands of ships and those hundreds, tens of thousands of men onto that beach, those beaches, at the time that they did. It was a magnificent thing to have achieved.
And can you discuss about the atmosphere and the final preparations within the British camp just before we went into action?
Well, obviously, the guys had been pretty much penned up in their camps. They were denied any leave because obviously there was a big fear that security could be breached. And remember that a big part of the D-Day planning was Operation Fortitude, which was the deception operation. That was a major part in the success of the Normandy landing. The Germans, even when we were coming ashore at Normandy, had been persuaded by our agents, Pujol and others, that this was a diversion and that the main attack would be Pas-de-Calais, which is where they were expecting. So the need to maintain that secrecy, that security, was absolutely paramount. Of course, the guys, remember, were keyed up. They were trained and trained and trained and trained. They were keyed up. They were ready. And I think the main element prior to actually taking to the boats or taking to the air was frustration. They were itching to get at it. And if you're stuck in camp and nothing's happening except it's raining, then it's the boredom is the main feature. What they wanted to do was to get into action.
Yeah. And Operation Fortitude for our listeners, where was that from and where was that to? Was that from Scotland?
A lot of it was from Scotland. There was a raft of agents whose job was to convince the Germans that the landings would take place anywhere but Normandy. There was quite a big intelligence operation directed to making the Germans think we might actually attack Norway.
Yeah.
And Hitler beefed up this garrison in Norway. So effectively, he created a POW camp for 100,000 Germans because he thought that we might invade across the North Sea to Norway. And the German, and our agents, people like Jean Pujol, they were playing on the Germans' natural suspicion that the attack would come to Pas-de-Calais because the Germans thought, well, in amphibious attack, you're going to spend the least time on the water that you can, and it has to be a first-day objective to seize a major port. That was their thinking, that obviously if the Allies do get a foothold, they will need a major port through which you can bring in resupply. Therefore, Calais was the obvious choice. The Germans had never twigged the Mulberry Harbours. They never got that we would actually take the ports with us.
Thank God for that.
Yeah, a stroke of engineering genius that we could construct effectively, flat-packed IKEA-style ports to transport across the Channel. The Germans never, and they weren't really having much chance to overfly Britain, so they never really saw what was happening. That one really took them by surprise.
And what intelligence was gathered before the landings that proved crucial?
There was a fair bit because Operation Jubilee, which was the August 1942 raid on Dieppe, which was a disaster, had shown up a number of flaws in Allied perceived planning, one of which was that wherever you landed, the beaches had to be firm enough to take tanks. Seems a bit of a no-brainer, but also on Dieppe, the tanks ended up thrashing among the shingle and couldn't get off the beach. They were just sitting ducks. So what was important was knowing how firm the sand conditions would be. And again, the mid-tide was about the right. And Montgomery had teams of commanders taking across the submarines and going ashore in small boats to bring back sand samples from the Normandy beaches to make sure that the sand would be firm enough to test the sand, and that it would be firm enough to carry the weight of tanks. Because Monty's theory on how he would use his tanks on D-Day was completely different to previous thinking. He didn't want the tanks there simply to be there to support the infantry. He wanted the tanks to lead the way. He wanted tanks to lead on the beach and the infantry to follow on, obviously to minimise infantry casualties. And it worked.
So they went into that much detail, taking sand samples.
Crucial.
That's amazing.
Because obviously, if the tanks had not been able to move on the sand, then it would have been a disaster.
Yeah,
it would have been sitting ducks, and the guys would have been shot to pieces. And not only that, but perhaps Monty's greatest stroke of genius was to rehabilitate his brother-in-law, General Sir Percy Hobart. Now, Hobart was an old-time exponent, pre-war exponent of armoured power, but he was so objectionable to his superiors, all he could get by 1943 was being a corporal in the Home Guard. But Monty rescued him and put him in command of 79th Armoured Division, which didn't actually exist. It was a think tank to produce this weird legion of hybrid tanks called Hobart's Funnies, which looked like something out of Monty Python, but in reality, they did the job. Yeah. This whole range of specialist tanks that Hobart designed, his swimming tank, his flail tank, his scorpion tanks, his petard, bunker-busting petard tanks, they were incredible. And they definitely saved thousands of British and Canadian lives on the D-Day beaches.
Yeah, I've seen like in films where they've got the tank with the flamethrower on it, and I didn't know where that came from. And reading your book, I found out where that came from. That came from the same guy.
Oh, but all of the bridge laying tanks, trench crossing tanks. He had a tank, a variant to cover just about every obstacle that they thought the guys would encounter on the beach. Of course, having the flail tank, it sounds almost biblical. You beat the ground with chains to blow up the mines, but it's the way clearing a path through minefields and saves, and the infantry can follow on and be free from the mines.
Brilliant. Focusing on the airborne drop now, what was the main mission of the paratroopers there?
The British airborne forces deployed on the night of the 5th and 6th really had three main objectives, two of which were specialised, one which was perhaps more general. And the whole major was to guard the eastern flank of the invasion force. That was the big job. So to do that, it was necessary to seize the river and canal bridges across the Orne River and Canal, Pegasus Bridge is known. It was necessary to seize the high ground around Ronville to prevent the Germans from attacking from the east, to destroy all the bridges across the connecting rivers, and to capture the Merville Battery, because it was feared that there were big 155mm guns in that battery, which, if they were allowed to deploy, had Sword Beach in their sights. So had those guns been there, had they not been captured, then clearly that battery could have wreaked havoc on the beach. So those are the main objectives of the paratroop operations, all of which are successful.
And I've just got one word on my paper. It says gliders. Now, when I personally think of a glider, I just think of almost like a balsa wood thing covered in tissue paper. That's all I think. That's all I think about. Yeah. Can you tell us what the gliders that were made for World War II involved?
The British Army had little or no experience of glider warfare in 1940. The potential was brought home very graphically when the Germans landed gliders, paratroops, Fallschirmjäger, on top of the Belgian forts at Eban-Emael, and 78 Germans fought and captured 1,200 Belgians. It was that effective. We then decided that we obviously needed paratroopers, and there's two ways you can deliver paratroops. You can get guys to wear parachutes and jump out of planes, which means it can be scattered, and it's often difficult to get their heavy weapons with them, or you land them in gliders. Now, this is not the sort of glider you see at your local aero club. The gliders that we had, horse and Hamilcar, were essentially they were big. Actually, look at them, they are big aircraft. The Hamilcar could take jeeps and light artillery, and even the light Tetrarch tank. But they were mainly made out of plywood. So although they are big, they have long wings, and obviously they do glide. Now, the first time we attempted to use glider drop was an attempt prior to the raid on Telemark called Operation Freshman, where we dropped gliders, or attempted to drop gliders, full of Royal Engineer commandos to sabotage the German heavy water works at Vermont. This was in November 1942, and it was an unmitigated disaster. Anybody who knew about glider warfare would say, do not try and drop gliders into Norwegian mountains in winter, because it isn't going to end well, and it didn't. The gliders crashed, one of the turret planes crashed, The men either killed on impact or they were captured, and then they were murdered by the Germans under the terms of Hitler's Commanderbefehl. So that wasn't a very good start. However, by the time D-Day came around, training and preparation and the use of gliders was infinitely more advanced. The terrain in Normandy was far more suitable for glider warfare. And perhaps the classic example was Howard's two companies with the Ox and Bucks light infantry, who were parachuted in to capture the Orne River and Orne Canal bridges. And they actually, glider pilots in the dark, actually managed to get their gliders down, I think it was about 20 meters of the bridge. Astonishing feat. And that, the use of gliders in that operation was greatly facilitated its success.
And like other gliders, are they pulled along by other planes and then let go?
There's a plane called a tug or a tow. So essentially, your glider is attached by a long rope to a Lancaster or Stirling, a fairly powerful 4-engine aircraft, which lifts off and pulls the glider up into the air. At a certain point, certain distance from the target, you release the tug, and the glider then floats, hopefully. And obviously has pilots. There are two pilots. The glider regiment pilots, these were specialized glider pilots, were steering these things. And these guys are perhaps some of the great undersung heroes of the war. I mean, it's a hell of a thing in the dark to fly a heavily laden glider and be able to get it down without any lights, just where it should be. That's pretty impressive. Highly risky business, but on D-Day it actually worked.
Yeah, I don't think you see gliders enough in the movies.
No, not at all. I mean, obviously, Arnhem, the gliders were used at Arnhem later, which didn't work well because of all the problems that the operation had. But certainly, the use of gliders in D-Day, particularly in relation to Pegasus Bridge, was a great success.
The paratroopers landing as well as the beach landings, what successes or setbacks did they come across?
Okay, to give you a good example, the assault on the Merville Battery. Now, Lieutenant Colonel Terence Otway, he was tasked to assault the Merville Battery with a full battalion, let's say 600 paratroopers, who would have mortars and machine guns and have heavy weapons with them. But as it happened on the night, and this was the big risk, of course, the drop was widely scattered. The guys were scattered miles away from the drop zone. And when he came to assemble his force to assault this battery, which was well defended, he only had 150 men. He had a quarter of his men and no heavy weapons. Just to make it worse, the RAF had been due to bomb the battery before the attack went in. But they missed the battery and bombed the nearby village, which was in flames, which lit up the whole scene, and of course it woken the Germans up. So from Otway's perspective, it couldn't have gotten much worse. But a lesser man might have said, well, fair enough, this is it, we can't do this. But he sort of said, right, lads, are we up for this? And yes, they were. And they attacked with that small force. He took on the Merville Battery and took it at some cost. He lost half his men. Half of them were dead and wounded by the end of the battle. But they took the battery, sorted out the Germans, and achieved their objective. The only thing they found out was when they got into the casements, there were no big guns in there. They weren't big guns at all. They were just old, I think they were old second-hand Czech weapons that couldn't reach the beaches that they tried. So, but it had to be done. Nobody knew that. Nobody knew that the battery was not as well prepared as it should have been. It was certainly well defended. And if one goes there today, it's a marvellous sight. But it was due to Otway's sheer bloody mindedness and tenacity and the fighting spirit of his men, they overcame the difficulty. But the reality was that attack should never have succeeded. But it did.
I really, when I think about it, I really don't know how soldiers, I know that they're trained to do that, but they walk into battle knowing that that could be their last day.
Yeah.
And to do that for their country is unbelievable. And I don't think that people think about it enough.
No, I agree. What all of these men and women who served in both wars and subsequently, what they did was with their blood and sacrifice, they have bought us all of our liberties today. The mere fact we're free to have this kind of conversation, the mere fact that we have free elections, that we have a democratic society, that rights, those privileges did not come free.
No.
They were paid for in blood.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, yes, these were young men, obviously. They were average age 18, and you sort of pretty much think you're immortal when you're 18. It's always going to happen to the other fella. They were highly trained. They've been trained and trained and trained. So this is what they were there to do. And the training is clearly a very important part, because once you're in battle, everything really is a kind of reflex.
Yeah.
If you've got to think about it, it's too late. You've really just got to just do it because you know what you're doing instinctively. So the level of training and preparation, and particularly the paratroop forces, these were elite forces. Along with the they were volunteers. You couldn't be conscripted into the paras, you had to volunteer. So, and yet, the ordinary guys who came ashore on the beaches were just that. They were ordinary lads. They were your fathers and your brothers and your uncles. You know, these are the guys at the end of the war just took off the uniforms and went back to their civil jobs. So they weren't supermen or women. They were just they were essentially ordinary people, but who, to borrow a phrase from Richard Holmes, they did extraordinary things in very extraordinary times.
Yeah, and I mean, once you're out of that plane, that's it.
Yeah,
innit? You are at the mercy of whatever's below you.
Yes.
So I think it takes some guts to jump out of a plane like that and be so vulnerable. Unbelievable.
I do. I mean, I've never seen any reason why I'd want to jump out of a perfect good aeroplane if it's, if it's right. And yes, as you say, once you are on the static line, once you are out of that aircraft, you're at the mercy of a hell of a lot of things. The weather, obviously, the wind. Yeah. The fact, certainly in the American case, the paratroops were being scattered over because of the conditions. They were scattered over a very wide area. Mm-hmm. You're jumping literally into the dark because obviously there's a blackout. There's no lights. Then there's no particular guidance to where you should be. A tragic case in the American with the American paratroops was a lot of the guys who were trying to take San Merides actually came down into the village. And the village was on fire. There was a domestic fire in the village. So the Germans were shooting them out of the sky. And there you are coming down your parachute. There's not much you can do about it.
No. And I know that you have spoken to people who were there.
Yes.
And can you tell me one of your most vivid recollections of talking to an airborne veteran?
An airborne veteran, yes. Well, I have obviously interviewed quite a number of airborne veterans, and I interviewed a couple of chaps who had been involved in the assault on the Mobile batteries back in the 1980s, 90s, when they were still, relatively young. Still had all their recollections correct. And I think the thing that comes across many when you speak to these guys is that they didn't think they were doing anything extraordinary. As far as they were concerned, this was the job they'd been trained to do. And that's what they did. They were very modest, all of them. Yes, they would talk, but only if you asked them. And they certainly didn't they didn't boast or brag. They were very modest about what they had achieved. And a common factor amongst men in combat is that often they don't remember the actual fighting.
Right.
The adrenaline's pumping, and I spent a lot of veterans who I knew what they did from what other people said, but they generally could not recollect what they had actually done under fire, such as the intensity. They could tell you other things. They could tell you about. There's the famous tale of Major Howard when he came, having taken Pegasus Bridge, when he crossed the bridge to the Café Gondry, where Papa Gondry was obviously being woken by the noise and thought, "Oh, is this the invasion?" And then, being English, of course, he knocks very politely on the door. Papa Gondry comes down, opens the door, and Howard says, "Look here, do you think you can make the lads a cup of tea?" And Papa Gondry says, "Les Anglais? Oh, I can do better than that." So he goes out in the garden and gets a couple of the paratroopers to dig up his cache of vintage champagne, which he'd hidden from the Germans. He had a very fine cellar, and he was damned if the Germans were going to drink it. So he buried numerous cases of top-end champagne in his garden. They dug them up, and he just handed them out to the lads. And of course, as Howard Litt said, his lads, they weren't used to champagne, especially vintage stuff. And he said quite a few of them weren't necessarily that fit for duty for the next few hours because they were just swinging this stuff down, no idea of its potency. And, they thought it would just taste like lemonade.
My God.
So he had to actually take the bottles off them at the end. But it was a great story. Obviously, Arlette Gondry, who's still there, will tell you that story. So it is, I think, the key thing that I would find from people I've spoken to, Paris, whichever Paris service they were in, was that they, as far as they were, you were just doing your bit. You did your job. And you did it for your mates. The big thing is that you were there with your mates. So the people you didn't want to let down were your mates. That was the big thing. You didn't let your mates down. And I think that was a major consideration. You're part of the unit. The unit are a kind of family. Some ways more important than the family. And you don't let them down.
I mean, there's a story that I heard from, it was the making of Bridge Too Far.
Yeah.
And Anthony Hopkins was, he walked across the street he run across the street under fire, and hid under a bridge. And after the shoot, he said to the guy who was playing, the real guy, he said, "Did I do a good job?" And he said, "Well, I walked across the street." And he said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "I walked across the street." He said, "But you were under fire." He said, "Yeah, but you can't show that you're scared."
That was Frost. He was playing.
Wow.
Yes, very cool customer. Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yes, especially from an officer's perspective. You couldn't be seen to panic, or you couldn't be seen to be worried, because the lads were looking to you. So, and again, a lot of these officers were very young. Say they were men. Half of them weren't men at all. They were just boys. They were only boys.
Crazy.
It is astonishing.
And move to the landings now. What were the main obstacles that were faced by the 3rd Infantry on Sword Beach?
Well, Sword Beach itself, obviously, it was a built-up area. I mean, when it goes to Sword Beach, they were built. It was a seaside resort, which the Germans, as only the Germans could, had turned all the villas and larger buildings into strongly fortified positions. So the difference, firstly, with the beach obstacles, which SBS had come ashore to defuse the explosives on the beach obstacles, and then once you're on the beach, the only way to go is up the beach. Because you can't run left, you can't run right, and the Germans have guns with enfilade fire covering the beaches, because they know exactly what a beach landing is going to look like. So the obstacles on Sword Beach, and for the first day, D-Day itself, were firstly to get through the crust of the German defences, to break through the crust. And of course, Lovett's commandos, they did a fair bit of hard slog to batter their way through the Atlantic Wall, because his job was to link up with Howard at the bridge.
Yeah,
the famous moment when Bill Millen pipes the commandos over the bridge. Even again, though they're under fire, Lovett insists on walking across the bridge with his pipers skirling a merry tune. And when he meets Howard, he said, "Awfully sorry, chap, we're 2 minutes late. Dreadfully sorry." So once the infantry were through the main obstacles on the beach, once into open country, once the tanks had cleared minefields, once they were actually able to progress, their first day objective from Sword was to take Caen itself. Now, this was one of Montgomery's less good ideas, because it should have been obvious that to take Caen on the first day wasn't going to happen. It was impossible. And perhaps, although the landings themselves were meticulously planned, there has been not quite as much thought going into that gap between the beach and Caen. Because the Germans had obviously thought the Caen would be first day objective for anybody invading. So they had built 2 huge defensive complexes called Hillman and Morris between the beach and Caen. And also the Germans had a reserve panzer division at Caen. Now, we were lucky because Hitler was sick of the squabbling between von Rundstedt and Rommel as to where the tanks should be. And he said, "Right, lads, I'll tell you what's going to happen. I will decide when I release the panzers. And those tanks will not move without my say-so." Fine. But Hitler sleeps in till noon every day. And nobody dares wake him up and say, "By the way, Adolf, you might want to make a decision here, because guess what? The Allies are ashore on the beaches." So there was a delay in releasing the panzers, which certainly helped us. But by the late afternoon, evening, when our chaps were approaching anywhere near Caen, there was an iron crust of German defence. Of course, it took 6 weeks to take Caen. Mm-hmm. So the main series of obstacles in terms of the troops coming ashore was the crust, the hard crust of shore defences, plus the inland barriers, Hillman and Morris, and then this crust of armour, which was forming around Caen.
Right. Wow. I was going to ask you about that later on, but that was a good full answer. Thank you. And, what on Sword Beach? What we've talked about the Hobart's funnies. How were they used on Sword Beach, especially?
Well, all of the tanks which he had designed were used. Each fulfilled its function. Mm-hmm. The bunker buses, the petard tanks, basically had a short, stubby mortar-type gun rather than a tank gun, and their job was to get as close to a bunker as possible and just blast it. Mm-hmm. It's almost like a one-shot weapon. Blast a bunker at point-blank range with a very heavy caliber shell, and that worked, and that helped to blast through the obstacles. The flame-throwing tanks, obviously, they were also very effective against bunkers. And Hobart's, perhaps his most brilliant folly, but it worked, were these swimming tanks, the duplex drive tanks, where they actually allowed the Cromwell or Sherman tanks could be made to swim by fixing a propeller. So they had a duplex, that was a duplex drive, propeller and tracks, launching them in the sea with a canvas, a set of skirts, a canvas, roses of canvas screen to give buoyancy. Now, Hobart was very particular about it. So you can't launch the tanks any more than 3,000 yards out because the swell will be too great. And if the sea is rough, don't even think about it. Because you've got a 30-ton tank here, which is trying to swim, which it seems like I think the Germans never. It's not the German mentality. They just didn't think anybody would be daft enough to try that. And yet again, that worked. Where it didn't work was Omaha, because the American Bradley didn't really want Hobart's funnies. He thought it was just H.G. Wells stuff. Had he had them on Omaha Beach, it would have made a big difference. And he had 30, I think it was, duplex drive tanks, but he launched them at 6,000 yards in a rough sea, and they all went down. Once that starts to go down, well, it's going to go down pretty quick. God help if you're inside it. The man in the turret might get out, but nobody else is going to. So, a very nasty business.
Well, on Juno Beach now, what was the difference? Because that's where the Canadians landed. Am I right?
Yeah.
What was the main difference between that and Golden Sword?
In some ways, they were similar in that they were obviously, again, the Juno Beaches were in a pretty built-up area, and the Germans were exceptionally well dug in. But the Canadians made very good use of Hobart's funnies. They made good use of their armor. They're exceptionally brave men, obviously. They took pretty heavy casualties, but they blasted their way through, and actually they achieved one of the deepest penetrations on D-Day. So again, similar set of circumstances on all of the beaches. The objective is to get off the beach as quick as you can and begin to expand the bridgehead. Because Rommel's view always was that if the Allies got ashore, he probably thought he couldn't stop them getting ashore, but then to use the panzers for an all-out counterattack to push our guys back into the sea, which Hitler had frustrated. Actually, our best ally on D-Day was Adolf Hitler, because he slept in. And had the tanks been released earlier, then it could have made life very, very difficult for our guys. So the Canadians were facing similar difficulties, similar hazards, and they with great gallantry overcame them.
Was the German resistance more intense on Juno, or was it equal on all beaches, really?
It is interesting because the quality of the German defenders varied quite dramatically. A lot of the German defenders were old men and boys. They were almost reservists. There were some elite German troops. But they also had big gaps in the line, which were held either by Russian Hiwis, they were white Russians, and Indian Army prisoners. The German Light Infantry, when they came ashore at Gold Beach, were astonished to find they were taking soldiers from the Indian Army in German uniform as prisoners. These are guys who've been captured in the Western Desert. Were sort of given the choice, well, do you want to go in the POW camp or do you want to fight for us? And they thought, what the hell, this is 3 square meals a day. They've fought for the Germans. And the DLI captured Russians, which they didn't expect, and they captured Indians, which they didn't expect. And the view among our guys was, well, these blokes are traitors and that we don't necessarily accept their surrender. There was a thought that maybe they should just be shot, but they weren't. They were taken prisoner. So the quality of the defenders was varied. But on Omaha Beach, you had top quality German troops well dug in, which is how they were able to inflict so many casualties on the Americans, and a number of German E-boats, which is suicidal courage, attacked the Allied fleet. I think it was 5 or 6 E-boats. These are not torpedo boats. Attacked the Allied fleet. Now, that's 6 ships against 6,000, and yet one of them got through and actually sank a Norwegian destroyer. The Svenne was sunk by a torpedo from an E-boat. So that's pretty impressive. What everyone thinks about that is serious courage, because these guys must have known they weren't coming back. So they always say the caliber, and the Germans. I remember many years ago going to a lecture by the late Peter Young, Brigadier Peter Young, who commanded Number 5 Commando and others. He fought right across the globe in the Second World War. And somebody said to him at the end of the lecture, well, of all the opponents that you faced in your military career, who were the toughest, who were the most fierce? He said, lad, if you ain't fought the Germans, you ain't never been to war. So the Germans were generally pretty rock solid in defence.
Yeah.
Even their second line troops would fight. And of course, these guys had prepared defensive positions. They weren't being required to attack. They were simply defending, which is an easier of the two tasks. So I think it's fair to say the quality of the German resistance was pretty impressive, but it was varied. It was mixed.
Yeah. And moving on to Gold Beach, what was the biggest challenge for the British troops on Gold Beach?
Well, the big challenge was to reach their objective, which was Bayeux. The first day objective for the 50th Division, Division, was to reach Bayeux. And again, the German resistance on the beaches was severe, was fierce. And of course, one of the great legends of D-Day is Sergeant Stan Hollis of the Queen Howards, who, with his men dropping left, right, he was the NCO, men dropping left, right, and centre, officers knocked out of his battalion. Stan seizes a Bren gun and charges the beach single-handed. Takes out several officers and continues to do a lot more damage to the Germans as they're going inland, for which he was entirely deservedly awarded a Victoria Cross. But again, once the 50th Div had broken through the crest of the German defences, they again achieved. They didn't quite get to Bayeux on the first day. They took it on the next day, so they did pretty well overall. One of the units in 50th Division was 151 Brigade, 6th, 8th, and 9th Durham Light Infantry, and they had been one of the units. They had fought at Dunkirk, the Battle for France, and they'd always said, it was said, I had interviewed a lot of guys from DLI, that as they were retreating through Belgium to Dunkirk, and the local people were doing their very best to help them, they all said, don't worry, guys, we'll be back. And the Belgians thought, well, yeah, only in your dreams. Looking at the shambles of Dunkirk, they thought, well, nobody's ever going to come back from this. And yet, 4 years on, here's 151 Brigade on the beaches. And as they advanced inland during the course of the Battle for Normandy, it was 6th Battalion came to a particular French village. And it turned out they'd been there in 1940. And the mayor came up to to welcome the newcomers. And the mayor said to the colonel in charge, we've got your instruments. In 1940, the regimental band had left all their instruments behind in the retreat to Dunkirk. And the villagers had each taken an instrument and hidden it to keep for when our guys came back. No, the penalty for that would have been death. And the colonel, he just said he couldn't speak. He wasn't able to speak at that point.
Wow. So, what role did the tides play in the landings, beach landings?
Fair to say, like the weather, were critical because the key thing is you've got to get established generally, and you've got to get on that beach. If you're going on at the mid-tide to avoid obstacles, that means the tide is coming in after you. So if you don't get off the beach, you're going to be swamped by the tide. And your whole build-up, your whole delivery of supply, etc., is going to be held up. So hitting the beach at the right time, getting up the beach, bursting through the crest of the shore defences, and getting inland, establishing your control over the beachhead is absolutely essential.
Yeah.
If you get that wrong, and it nearly went wrong at Utah Beach, or the American landing beaches, where they ended up even though it wasn't a particularly difficult beach in terms of the assault, they ended up with a huge traffic jam on the beach. And tide coming in, traffic building up. It took Lieutenant Colonel Roosevelt, was he General? No, I think Major General Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's son, to sort it out. And this guy walked up and down the beach, sorting everything out. And got them off the beach, saved the day effectively. Though ironically, he died of a heart attack a couple of days later.
Oh wow!
Stress is too much because he was an older officer. So the naval operation, which is Operation Neptune, obviously, which is how you get all those men across the channel with all of the kit that they need to effect the landing, with all of the naval gunfire support that they require, with the specialized landing craft that they need, and make sure those landing craft are in the right place at the right time, was a terrific operation. And again, the Overlord, the actual landings, would never have stood a chance if the naval planning had not been as exemplary as it was. Admiral Ramsey, who planned Operation Neptune, he actually also planned Dynamo, of course. He got the guys off the beaches in 1940. The naval planners did a fantastic job, brilliant job.
And I suppose if you've got that log jam on the beach, you're a sitting duck, then, aren't you?
Absolutely. Yes. If the panzers do arrive, then you are in serious trouble. Yes.
Yeah.
If you
Wow.
have a lot of men and vehicles crowded onto a beach, then you are in trouble. And obviously, the Luftwaffe didn't have anything. It didn't really have much access to the beaches. The RAF and US AAF controlled the skies, thank God. But yes, too many men in a logjam on a beach, you could potentially be in serious trouble. And of course, you're massively exposed to a counterattack.
Wow. And your in your chapter, Getting a Grip, that details the afternoon. And what
Yes.
was the most significant breakthrough in the afternoon on June the 6th?
I think the breakthrough, probably, in terms of the whole of the Allied landings, was the fact that the Americans managed to get off the beach at Omaha.
Mm-hmm.
There was a real fear. Bradley thought at one point the losses were so great, progress was stalled, he might actually have to evacuate the beach, which would be a disaster.
Mm-hmm.
That left a huge gap between Utah and obviously Gold Beach. So, firstly, actually getting a foothold, and that's all they ever did in the day, but it was a hell of a thing. A foothold in Omaha was tremendous. From the British, Canadian beaches perspective, breaking through the crust, even though they didn't advance necessarily as far as had been hoped, it did mean that there was a viable bridgehead. And that, in due course, there would be a link up with the Americans. And that the next day, June 7th, Bayeux fell, but though it would be some weeks before Caen fell, and the failure to take Caen on the first day had serious ramifications for the whole campaign.
And was that Montgomery just underestimating the resistance he was going to come across?
I think yes, actually, to put it bluntly. Now, after the battle, Montgomery would spun it rather differently. He had said it'd always be his intention, and I get this, and he was, at the end of the day, he was right, to draw down the Germans on the British and Canadian forces on the east side and give the Americans time to build up their position on the west side, and then they would attack the Germans in the flank and effectively roll up the German position, which at the end of the day was what happened, Operation Cobra.
Yeah.
But I think there may have been a certain element of wisdom after the event, because the fact was that the British and Canadian attack was stalled for weeks.
Yeah.
Two things that Montgomery had not thought of. Firstly, how tough a nut to crack Caen was going to be. And secondly, and nobody seems to have got this, that once you're off the beaches, that's great. But what about the bocage? Everyone seems to think once you're off the beaches, it's just through rolling fields toward any greater objective. The nature of the agricultural terrain in Normandy had not been fully considered. You have these high hedges with deep embankments, small hedges, small, immensely strong stone-built farmhouses, a maze of fields in which a few guys with Panzerfaust can hold up a division. So the nature of how that ground would favour the defenders, as it did, didn't really, I think, feature as large as it should have done in the eye. Because now when you go to Normandy, most of those have been ploughed up, so you get very rare, you get glimpses of what the land pattern was in 1944. It's very different. Yeah. When you do see a pattern, you think, God almighty, would you want to fight through this? Not really.
Which is unusual, really, that they didn't take that into consideration, totally. Seeing as they were taking sand samples for see how firm it was.
Yes.
So they were really detailed in some parts and not detailed at all in others.
It does seem as though the actual mechanics of landing on the beach were brilliantly planned.
Yeah.
Not everything went according to plan, it was never going to, but it was pretty bloody good. But those two major difficulties, getting to Caen, which was never a viable first objective, and then the fight through this dense hinterland had not been fully factored in. Not at all.
Yeah. And after the landings were achieved, how quickly were they able to link up and create a bridgehead?
Very quickly.
Bridgehead.
The British and the Americans just west of Armarsh were able to link up fairly quickly. The American Rangers had done a fantastic job in taking the shore, the coastal battery, the clifftop battery, and the link up actually went pretty well. The American paratroopers even though they were scattered, had managed to secure the exits from Utah Beach. So, and the plan to walk battery, as I mentioned, was taken. So the link up actually went, I think, in the circumstances, pretty smoothly.
Mm.
And indeed, at the end of the day, the Americans, who very quickly took counterattack and Salo, did and were able to build up their strength in the west. They took the Kutantap Peninsula, obviously. Although we took Cherbourg, it took too long to clear because the Germans had, of course, done their best to destroy the port. And then in July, when Radley mounted Operation Cobra, that was successful.
Mm-hmm.
And the German counterattack, the Mortain counteroffensive, one of Hitler's worst ideas, faltered, of course, and Hitler was too slow in allowing his generals to withdraw from Normandy, which meant that a large number of his men were caught in the Falaise pocket. And, of course, that was the end of the Battle of Normandy. And also, although it was a long, hard-fought, desperate and bloody battle from the Allies' perspective, once it was won, the German position in France unraveled very quickly.
Yeah.
And the Germans simply began retreating.
And finally, as I said in the intro, you spoke to a lot of veterans.
Yes.
I want to know personally what it was like to talk to. I know that you were very humble.
Yeah.
But what was your feeling like talking to people like that?
Well, these are obviously people of my father's generation. He was the wartime generation. So I knew a lot of guys from family who'd been in the war.
Right, okay.
So it was if these people were strangers. They were. I was familiar with their generation.
Yeah.
And generations differ, obviously. And with these guys, if they knew that you were serious, that you weren't just, you weren't looking for sensation or you weren't looking for some clever anecdote, you actually wanted to know, genuinely and objectively, what had happened, they would talk to you. And they always did so on a measured basis. Mm-hmm. And nobody I spoke to ever played up their exploits. They were humble, forthright. I think they were. They certainly didn't brag. They didn't boast. They just told you what happened. One of the best stories that ever happened wasn't actually me. It was a pal of mine who was also collecting testimony. His father had been a beachmaster on Gold Beach. Now, being a beachmaster, you're the guy in charge of the traffic jam.
Yeah.
You're a must-kill target for every German in Normandy. So, pretty risky business. And he'd often asked his father, "Well, can you tell me what it was like? What was it actually like on D-Day?" He said, "Oh, no, been there, done me, but don't want to talk about it." Years later, the old boy's in a nursing home. Obviously, hasn't got that long to go. So my pal says, "Well, Dad, if you're going to tell me now, it's as good a time as any." The old man said, "All right, son. Yep, fair enough. I'll tell you what it's like on D-Day." He said it was all very, very noisy, and I had the distinct impression we weren't at all welcome. That was it. That was all he had to say. That was a one-sentence summary of D-Day. I reckon that's pretty hard to beat, actually. That was the guy there. He just did it and got on with it.
That's amazing. And one last question, actually, because I've worked and spent time with kids, like teenagers.
Yeah, me too.
Who don't respect what they did. That say if they were in that position, they'd never fight for this country because this country stinks or whatever. And they don't agree with Poppy Day or anything like that. What do you think of the generation that is coming up completely disrespecting these guys?
Well, I wouldn't wish to be politically controversial, but I hate woke. And the woke waffer, those who are in charge, who are Maoists as far as I'm concerned. And woke is a new version of the Cultural Revolution. Stop the politics. That attitude is responsible.
Yeah.
And there's an agenda behind it for the manner in which kids today are perhaps indoctrinated rather than educated. And yet, I've seen it because I'm in the north of England, and the north of England has always been a very fertile recruiting ground for the armed forces. So when I go into schools, I ask how many of the kids in that class have family who have or are serving the armed forces.
Mm-hmm.
And in a typical Northumbrian school, the Newcastle school, you'll have maybe 30 or even 40% will have had some of their family will be in the armed forces.
Yeah.
So there is a connection there. And the cadet movement is pretty strong. So I am beginning to find that that might be changing slightly. And certainly I've been in a dozen schools over the last 2 weeks.
Yeah.
at varying age groups, from 6, 7, 8, 9, all that. There's sort of quite a spread of ages.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been very pleased to note that there seems to be a generation of teachers now who are taking this seriously, and the kids, when you talk to them, do understand about remembrance. When I ask them, I ask the class, does it matter? Is it important to you? They're saying yes. And they get it. They get that modern wars, Ukraine and Gaza, are the result of the Second World War. So I think there is hope, should we say. I'm fully cognizant of what you're saying, and you are right. There has been a lot of damage done, deliberately done, for ideological reasons. Mm-hmm. But beyond all that, I think there is a growing awareness among young people of the importance of their families and their ancestors. And obviously, the people who fought were their ancestors. So it is their family service. And I think I think the people are very interested in family history these days. That's the kind of antidote to woke.
Yeah.
Because obviously, if you've discovered that your grandfather, your father, whoever, served in the war, whatever he or she did, that's a connection.
Mm-hmm.
And that connection is, because it's based on blood, is an important connection. So bizarrely, I think Ancestry.com have probably done a lot of good in relation to promoting our understanding of and our commemoration of the war. Having said that, what of course will happen now is that very soon there will be no veterans of the Second World War left alive.
Yeah.
And I used to know my grandfather's generation was the First World War. I was around when they were in their 70s and 80s, whatever. And many times I've taken veterans into schools. I've taken Holocaust survivors into schools.
Wow.
And of course, there is nothing can compare from a young person's perspective than having the opportunity to actually look into it and talk to somebody who was there.
Yeah.
Because then at the end, nobody can deny that once you spoke to these people, they're genuine. They were there. They happened. And if you spoke to somebody who was in Auschwitz, by the time they finished talking, the Holocaust happened. It wasn't it was magic. So there's a big movement to deny that in some quarters, to deny the Holocaust or to run it down or whatever. And so that connection is going to be lost. So it's down to people like us and then your generation, the historians. When we go into schools, we have to tell the stories of those who can no longer tell their stories. But we have their stories. It's our duty to pass them on, and I regard that as a sacred trust.
And this is why I do this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I want people to learn from it.
Yeah, that's our mission, is to teach.
It certainly is, and you do a good job with your book on D-Day.
Thank you. Do our best.
It's a very good book, everybody. I'll put a link down below so you can get your own copy. So thank you, John Sadler. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a great pleasure.
And mine as well. See you there. Thanks, John.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Thank you now. Bye-bye. For those of you still with me, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. And thank you so much to John Sadler for, again, a very interesting conversation. Now, next week, we shall be talking to Robert Gerwarth about Reinhard Heydrich, or the Butcher of Prague, who was the head of the SS, the head of the Gestapo, and one of the planners of the final solution. So that will be another very interesting conversation. So if you like this kind of content, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the channel, then please go to Buy Me a Coffee and give a small donation. Every little goes towards making a better show for you. So until next week, take care of yourselves, take care of each other. Bye-bye.